The crystal chandelier cast shadows across our family's mahogany dining table as Dad cleared his throat. At 74, Harold Whitman still commanded attention when he spoke. Tonight felt different, though. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen since Mom passed 3 years ago. "I've called you all here because I have important news to share," he began. His weathered hands folded carefully in front of him. Margaret shifted beside me, her lawyer instincts already on high alert. Thomas looked up from his phone, probably calculating quarterly projections for Whitman Oil even during family dinner. Jonathan, ever the peacemaker, simply waited. "I'm donating $350 million, Dad announced. The words hung in the air like smoke from an oil fire. $350 million. That was nearly half the family fortune built over 5 decades in the petroleum industry, starting with a single well outside Beaumont and growing into an empire spanning Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. "Dad, that's wonderful," Margaret said carefully. "Which charity are you supporting?" His smile caught me off guard. It was the same expression he'd worn when he talked about Mom during their courtship stories. "It's not going to a charity. It's going to Isabella. Isabella." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "Who's Isabella?" "Isabella Martinez. She works here, takes care of the house. She's 28, and she's carrying my child." The silence that followed could have powered one of our drilling rigs. I felt the world tilt sideways, like when you hit a pocket of gas during a deep-bore operation. Margaret's face went pale. Jonathan set down his water glass with trembling hands. "Your child?" I managed to ask. Dad's expression softened in a way that made my chest tighten. "She told me last month, after everything I've lost, after your mother, I never thought I'd have this gift again. Isabella needs security. She needs protection. This money will ensure she and our baby never want for anything." I'd seen Isabella around the house for the past 8 months. Quiet, efficient, always polite when she served dinner or cleaned the study. Pretty in an understated way, with dark hair and careful eyes. But 28 years old? And pregnant by a man nearly 50 years her senior? "Dad, have you considered—" Margaret started. "I know what you're thinking," he interrupted, his voice taking on that steel edge that had intimidated oil executives for decades. "You think she's after the money. You think I'm some foolish old man being taken advantage of. But I've seen how she looks at me, how she cares for me. She doesn't want anything from me except love." Thomas leaned forward. "When did this relationship begin? We had no idea you were even—" "That's because you children only visit when you need something signed or want to discuss business." The sharpness in his voice cut deep. "Isabella has been here every day, listening to my stories, bringing me coffee the way I like it, sitting with me when the memories of your mother become too much to bear." The accusation stung because it held truth. Since Mom died, we had focused on the business, assuming Dad was managing his grief the same way he'd managed everything else, with quiet determination and endless work. We'd missed the loneliness, the vulnerability that someone like Isabella could exploit. "Where is she now?" Jonathan asked gently, resting. "The pregnancy has been difficult. Morning sickness, fatigue. She's been so brave through it all." Dad's voice carried a tenderness I remembered from childhood, when he'd comfort us after nightmares or scraped knees. "And you're planning to give her $350 million? Margaret's legal training kept her voice level, professional. "I've already begun the transfers. International trusts to protect her from taxation. The wedding is next week, small ceremony here in the garden. I want her to feel secure before the baby arrives." Next week. The timeline hit me like a sledgehammer. Financial transfers already in progress. A wedding planned without family input. This wasn't a gradual courtship. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign. "Dad, don't you think we should meet her properly? Get to know her before—" "Before what? Before I marry the woman I love? Before I provide for my unborn child?" His jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. "I've made my decision. The paperwork is being finalized tomorrow." As we left that night, walking past Isabella's small Honda in the circular driveway, I caught Margaret's eye. She nodded slightly, the same look we'd shared as children when we knew something was terribly wrong but couldn't yet prove it. Dad stood in the doorway, waving goodbye with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd found love again. But all I could think about was the timing, the secrecy, and the astronomical sum of money about to disappear from our family forever. Something was very, very wrong in the Whitman household. The memories came flooding back as I drove home that night. 8 months ago, when Isabella first appeared at the house, Dad had mentioned hiring additional help after Mrs. Patterson retired. Nothing unusual there. Wealthy Houston families always needed domestic staff. But now I understood the careful orchestration behind her arrival. It started innocently enough. Isabella would bring Dad his morning coffee while he reviewed oil futures in his study. She'd linger to ask about his day, genuinely interested in stories about wildcatting in East Texas during the 80s. Unlike the previous housekeepers who worked efficiently and invisibly, Isabella made herself present. "She reminds me of your mother," Dad had told Margaret during a Sunday visit last fall. "Not in looks, but in the way she listens. Really listens. That should have been our first warning. Sign. Mom had been Dad's intellectual equal, a geology professor at Rice University who could discuss reservoir engineering as easily as she planned charity galas. She'd challenged him, debated with him, stood her ground when his oil baron stubbornness surfaced. Isabella's approach was completely different, and far more dangerous. Where Mom had been Dad's partner, Isabella became his devoted admirer. She'd ask him to explain complex drilling operations, wide-eyed with apparent fascination. She'd request stories about building Whitman Oil from nothing, nodding appreciatively at tales we'd heard countless times. Most critically, she'd sit with him in the evenings when the big house felt too empty, when grief for Mom hit hardest. "Mr. Whitman looks so lonely," she'd told Margaret once, her voice soft with manufactured concern. "Sometimes I hear him talking to your mother's photograph in the library." The pregnancy announcement had been perfectly timed, just as Dad was beginning to emerge from his deepest grief, just as he'd started talking about updating his will to establish charitable foundations. Isabella revealed she was carrying his child. I remembered his phone call that day, his voice trembling with something between joy and disbelief. "Jonathan, I'm going to be a father again. At my age, can you believe it? Isabella. She's given me a reason to look forward instead of backward." The transformation had been immediate and complete. Dad, who'd built a petroleum empire through careful analysis and calculated risks, suddenly made decisions based purely on emotion. He'd moved Isabella from the small staff quarters to the guest wing. He'd hired the city's most expensive obstetrics team. He'd started talking about legacy. Not the family business legacy, but the legacy of this unborn child. Most disturbing was how Isabella had systematically isolated him from us. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just subtle redirections that made family visits feel like intrusions. "Your father is resting," became her standard response when we called. "The excitement about the baby has been exhausting for him." Or, "Mr. Whitman mentioned you've been so busy with the quarterly reports. He doesn't want to burden you with his personal matters." She'd positioned herself as his protector, shielding him from the stress of family involvement while simultaneously making herself indispensable. Dad, desperate for connection after 3 years of widowhood, had fallen completely under her influence. The legal preparations had been swift and thorough. Dad's longtime attorney, Robert Chen, had expressed private concerns to Margaret about the international trust structures being established. Accounts in Switzerland, holdings in Luxembourg, complex financial instruments designed to protect Isabella and the baby from potential inheritance disputes. "Your father is moving assets faster than I've ever seen," Chen had confided. When I suggested waiting until after the birth for genetic confirmation, he became furious. Said I was questioning his judgment and Isabella's character. That reaction should have told us everything. Dad, who'd never made a major business decision without extensive due diligence, was now transferring hundreds of millions based purely on trust and emotion. Isabella had played her role perfectly. The vulnerable young woman, grateful for his protection, carrying precious cargo that represented his genetic immortality. She'd awakened every paternal and protective instinct in a man who'd spent 3 years drowning in loneliness. But as I sat in my driveway that night, staring at my own modest ranch house, modest by Whitman standards, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watching a performance. The timing too convenient, the devotion too complete, the isolation too systematic. Margaret called as I was heading inside. "I've been thinking about tonight. Something's not right. The whole thing feels orchestrated," I agreed. "But Dad's not going to listen to suspicions. He's emotionally invested. More than invested. He's obsessed. Did you see how he defended her? Like she was already family and we were outsiders." Thomas's voice joined our conference call. "I've been looking at the financial projections. If he follows through with these transfers, it'll significantly impact the company's stability. $350 million represents our primary cash reserves." "That's exactly what worries me," Margaret said. "This isn't just about Dad finding companionship. This is about someone potentially dismantling everything he built." We had less than a week to figure out what was really happening in our father's house. Less than a week to save him from what increasingly looked like the most expensive mistake of his life. The question was, how do you protect someone who doesn't want to be protected? Margaret's law office in downtown Houston felt like a war room by Tuesday morning. Thomas had driven in from his River Oaks home, and I'd taken the day off from managing our Galveston operations. We had 4 days before Dad's wedding, and desperation was setting in. "I found someone," Margaret announced, sliding a business card across her mahogany conference table. "David Rodriguez, private investigator. Former FBI Financial Crimes Unit, now specializes in elder fraud cases." The card was simple, professional. No flashy graphics or promises, just a name, number, and the phrase, "truth through investigation." "How quickly can he work?" Thomas asked, checking his Rolex nervously. "He's coming at noon." I explained the timeline. Rodriguez arrived precisely on schedule. A compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of steady eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as we explained the situation, taking methodical notes in a leather portfolio. $350 million in 4 days, he repeated when we finished. International trusts already being established. And your father refuses to consider that he might be being deceived. Completely refuses, I confirmed. Yesterday, he told Margaret that we were just jealous of his happiness. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Classic pattern in romance fraud cases. The victim becomes emotionally invested in defending their abuser. It's a form of psychological capture. He flipped through his notes. "Tell me about Isabella Martinez. When exactly did she start working at the house?" 8 months ago, Thomas said. Dad mentioned needing extra help after his longtime housekeeper retired. "Do you know how she was hired?" "Agency referral, personal recommendation." We exchanged glances. None of us knew the details of Isabella's hiring process. Dad had simply announced that he'd found excellent help, and we'd accepted it without question. "That's our first lead," Rodriguez said, making a note. "Background verification, employment history, references. In my experience, sophisticated fraudsters create detailed false identities, but there are always gaps." He pulled out a tablet and began typing rapidly. Isabella Martinez, 28 years old, working as domestic help for a petroleum executive in Houston. "Let me run some preliminary searches while we talk." "What about the pregnancy?" Margaret asked. "Could that be fabricated?" "Possible, but unlikely. Too easy to verify medically. More likely the pregnancy is real, but the paternity is false. Has your father had genetic testing?" "He refuses," I said. "Says it would be insulting to Isabella to question her word." Rodriguez's expression darkened. "That's another red flag. Legitimate pregnancies welcome verification. Fraudulent ones avoid it." His tablet chimed softly. "Interesting. I'm finding 2 Isabella Martinez profiles in the Houston area, both 28 years old." He turned the screen toward us. 2 different women, both matching the general description but with subtle differences in features and background information. One shows a history of domestic work, basic education, no criminal record. The other shows a bachelor's degree in economics from UT Austin, graduated summa cum laude 5 years ago. Rodriguez looked up sharply. "Which woman is working in your father's house?" The room fell silent. An economics degree. Summa cum laude. This wasn't a simple housekeeper who'd gotten lucky. This was someone with sophisticated financial knowledge who'd deliberately misrepresented herself. "Run both profiles," Margaret said immediately. "Full background checks, employment histories, any criminal associations." "Already started," Rodriguez replied, fingers flying across his tablet. "I'm also going to check property records, financial transactions, and social media presence. If Isabella Martinez is running a con, she's not working alone. These operations require planning, resources, and usually multiple participants." Thomas leaned forward. "What do you mean, multiple participants?" "Romance fraud at this level is rarely a solo operation. Someone handles the initial contact and relationship building. Someone else manages the financial aspects. Often there's a technical person handling false documentation. And there's usually someone playing a supporting role, a friend, relative, or associate who provides credibility." My blood ran cold. "The gardener." "What gardener?" Rodriguez asked. "Marcus something?" Dad hired a new gardener around the same time Isabella started. Young guy, maybe early 30s, very attentive to his work, always around when Isabella is working. Rodriguez made rapid notes. "Full name? Background? How was he hired?" None of us knew. In 8 months, we'd barely paid attention to the household staff changes. Dad had always managed those details personally, and we'd been focused on business operations and our own lives. "I need access to your father's financial records," Rodriguez said. "Bank statements, investment accounts, the trust documentation being prepared. We need to understand exactly how the money is being moved and when." "Dad's attorney, Robert Chen, has expressed concerns," Margaret said. "He might cooperate if we explain the situation." "Good. I also need to observe Isabella directly. Can you arrange for me to visit the house?" "Dad won't allow us to bring in investigators," Thomas said. "He'd see it as a betrayal. Then we do it indirectly. I'll pose as a potential business associate, insurance adjuster, anyone with legitimate reason to be at the house. I need to see how she interacts with your father, study her behavior patterns." Rodriguez's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression grew grim. "Initial search results are coming back. The Isabella Martinez with the economics degree has some interesting associations. 2 previous employers, both elderly widowers, both in Texas, both experienced significant financial losses after brief relationships." The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. This wasn't opportunistic gold digging. This was systematic professional fraud, targeting vulnerable elderly men with substantial assets. "How long do you need for a complete investigation?" I asked. "Normally? 2 weeks minimum. With your timeline, I'll have preliminary results by Thursday, enough to present to your father if he'll listen." "And if he won't listen?" Margaret asked. Rodriguez closed his tablet and looked directly at each of us. "Then you'll need to decide how far you're willing to go to protect him. Because in my experience, when someone is this emotionally invested in their abuser, it sometimes takes extreme measures to break through the psychological capture. We had less than 72 hours to save our father from himself." Rodriguez called at 6 a.m. Thursday morning, his voice tight with urgency. "You need to get to my office immediately. All 3 of you. What I've found changes everything." By 7:30, we were seated around his cluttered desk, surrounded by printouts, photographs, and legal documents. Rodriguez looked like he'd been up all night, his shirt wrinkled and coffee cups scattered around his workspace. "Isabella Martinez doesn't exist," he began without preamble. "At least not the woman working in your father's house." He spread out 2 driver's licenses side by side. "The real Isabella Martinez, domestic worker, lives in San Antonio and has been employed by the same family for 3 years. The woman in your father's house is actually Elena Vasquez, age 29, originally from Phoenix." The photograph showed our Isabella's face but with different hair and clothing. More sophisticated, professional looking. Nothing like the modest housekeeper we'd known. Elena Vasquez graduated from Arizona State with a degree in economics and minor in psychology. But here's where it gets interesting. Rodriguez pulled out a thick folder. She's been married for 4 years to Marcus Delgado, your father's gardener. The room went dead silent. Married. For 4 years. Every interaction we'd witnessed, every moment of apparent innocence, had been part of an elaborate performance. They're a team, Rodriguez continued. Professional grifters specializing in romance fraud against elderly wealthy men. I've traced them through 3 previous operations across Texas and Arizona over the past 6 years. He laid out a series of photographs and documents. Victim number 1, Walter Pemberton, oil executive from Dallas, age 71. Lost $200,000 before his daughter intervened. Elena played the role of a struggling graduate student who needed help with tuition. Victim 2, James Morrison, real estate developer in Phoenix, age 68. Lost $400,000. Elena was a young widow with a sick child, desperately needing medical treatment funds. Victim 3, Robert Chen. Wait, that name should sound familiar, Margaret gasped. Robert Chen is Dad's attorney. Different Robert Chen, but the coincidence made me dig deeper. Robert Chen of Fort Worth, cattle rancher, age 73. Lost $600,000 before family members forced him into a nursing home and took control of his finances. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Each victim had been a widowed or divorced wealthy man, isolated and vulnerable. Each time, the requested amount had grown larger. Our father represented their biggest score yet. How do they operate? Thomas asked, his voice barely steady. Rodriguez pulled out a detailed timeline. Phase 1, infiltration. Marcus gets hired as household help. Gardener, handyman, maintenance worker. He scouts the target, identifies vulnerabilities, maps out financial assets. Duration, 2 to 3 months. Phase 2. Elena arrives in a different role. Maid, caretaker, personal assistant. Always someone with legitimate access but below the family's notice. She begins building emotional intimacy with the target, while Marcus feeds her intelligence about the family dynamics. Phase 3. The relationship deepens. Elena becomes indispensable emotionally, while gradually isolating the victim from family members and longtime friends. She presents herself as his protector against outside pressures. Phase 4. The pregnancy. Always perfectly timed for maximum emotional impact, usually when the victim is beginning to discuss wills or estate planning. This creates urgency and triggers protective instincts. Phase 5. Legal manipulation. Fast marriage, international trusts, complex financial instruments designed to move money quickly and make recovery difficult. I felt sick. Every detail of the past 8 months had followed this exact script. Dad's increasing isolation from family, his defensive reactions when we questioned Isabella, his rush to provide financial security, all of it had been orchestrated. The pregnancy, Margaret said quietly. Is it real? Rodriguez nodded grimly. Real pregnancy, false paternity. I obtained hair samples from Marcus's trimming tools in your father's garden shed. DNA comparison with material from Isabella's room confirms he's the biological father. Jesus, Thomas whispered. They're actually having a child together while running this con. It's not uncommon. The child becomes part of their long-term financial security. Even if the con is exposed, parental rights and child support provide ongoing access to the victim's resources. Rodriguez pulled out his final document, a bank statement. Most damning of all, Marcus Delgado has been receiving monthly payments of $5,000 for the past 6 months, deposited into an account in Phoenix. The payments come from a shell company that traces back to your father's personal discretionary fund. Dad's been paying Marcus? I couldn't process this betrayal. Why? Elena probably told your father that Marcus had financial troubles. Sick relative, gambling debts, something requiring help. Your father, being generous and wanting to protect Elena's friend, quietly arranged assistance. He never realized he was funding his own deception. Margaret was taking notes rapidly, her legal mind cataloging evidence. This is enough for criminal charges. Fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, probably racketeering if we can prove pattern of interstate crimes." "More than enough," Rodriguez agreed. "But here's the problem. Your father has to cooperate. If he refuses to press charges or testify against them, prosecution becomes much more difficult." "The wedding is tomorrow," Thomas said. "We're out of time for gentle persuasion." Rodriguez stood up, his expression grim but determined. "Then we crash the wedding. Full confrontation, all evidence presented publicly, DNA results, criminal background, previous victims, everything laid out where your father can't dismiss it as family jealousy." "That could destroy him emotionally," I said, thinking of Dad's fragile state since Mom passed away. "Not as much as losing $350 million to people who see him as nothing more than a paycheck," Rodriguez replied. "Your father is a smart man who built an empire through good judgment. Once he sees the evidence clearly, he'll make the right decision. We had 18 hours to save our father from the most sophisticated con artists any of us had ever encountered. The question was, would the truth set him free, or would it break his heart completely?" Friday morning, 18 hours before the wedding, Rodriguez's office looked like a federal task force command center. Financial documents covered every surface. Photographs were pinned to a makeshift evidence board, and 3 laptops ran continuous background searches. "The money trail is even worse than we thought," Rodriguez announced, pointing to a series of bank statements spread across his desk. "Your father has been systematically moving assets for 3 months, not just the past few weeks." The documents told a devastating story. Starting in February, Dad had begun liquidating stable investments, municipal bonds, blue-chip stocks, real estate holdings, and converting them to cash. The money had been moved through a series of domestic accounts before being transferred to international trusts. $200 million is already beyond easy recovery, Thomas said, his face ashen as he studied the transfer records. These Luxembourg accounts have banking secrecy laws that make asset retrieval extremely difficult. Margaret was reviewing legal documents with her typical methodical precision. The trust structures are sophisticated. Whoever designed these knew exactly how to maximize protection from creditors and family challenges. "This isn't amateur work," Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Elena and Marcus have been preparing this operation for months. Look at this." He pulled out a series of photographs taken with telephoto lenses. "These show Marcus conducting surveillance on your father's daily routines, noting when family members visit, documenting security procedures." The images were chilling. Marcus photographing Dad's morning walks, timing his arrival and departure from the office, even noting which banks he visited and when. Every detail of our father's life had been cataloged and analyzed. "Here's what really concerns me," Rodriguez continued, pulling out a thick folder. "Communications intercepts from Elena's phone show contact with someone called the Architect. I believe this operation is part of a larger criminal network." He spread out printed text messages. The language cold and professional. Target secured. Timeline accelerated. Architect's percentage confirmed at 20%. Family suspicion minimal. Proceeding to final phase as planned. Backup extraction ready if needed. Phoenix Safe House prepared. They have an exit strategy, I realized reading over the messages. If something goes wrong tomorrow, they disappear. "Not just disappear," Rodriguez said. "These messages reference previous operations in Nevada, California, and New Mexico. We're looking at an interstate criminal enterprise that's been targeting elderly wealthy men across the Southwest." Margaret's phone rang. She glanced at the display and answered immediately. "Robert Chen, what can you tell us?" We could hear Dad's attorney's agitated voice through the speaker. "Margaret, I've been trying to reach your father all morning. The final trust transfers are scheduled for this afternoon, immediately before the wedding ceremony. I've stalled as long as possible, but he's threatening to fire me if I don't execute the documents. Can you delay until tomorrow?" she asked. "Not without cause. Your father specifically instructed that the money be secured before the ceremony. He wants Isabella to know she's financially protected before they exchange vows." Rodriguez grabbed a notepad and scribbled a message. holding it up for Margaret to see. Ask about witness requirements. Robert, do the trust documents require witnesses? Yes, 3 independent witnesses for the final transfers. Your father requested that I arrange for my paralegal and 2 office staff members to attend the wedding and handle the documentation. Margaret's eyes met mine. If we could prevent the witnesses from attending, we might buy crucial time. But that would only delay the inevitable. Dad was determined to proceed. There's something else, Chen continued. I received a call this morning from an attorney in Phoenix representing someone named Marcus Delgado. They're requesting copies of the trust documents, claiming he has a financial interest in the proceedings. Rodriguez went rigid. They're preparing to challenge the trust from multiple angles. If the con is exposed, they want legal grounds to claim their share of the assets. Robert, under no circumstances should you provide those documents, Margaret said firmly. We have reason to believe there's fraud involved. Fraud? Margaret, what are you talking about? We had no choice but to bring Dad's attorney into our confidence. Margaret quickly explained our investigation. The false identities, the previous victims, the DNA evidence proving Marcus was the father of Isabella's child. The silence on the other end lasted nearly a minute. Finally, Chen spoke, his voice shaken. This explains so much. Harold's behavior, the rushed timeline, his refusal to consider standard protective measures. I thought he was just being emotional about becoming a father again. Can you help us? I asked. We need to present this evidence to Dad in a way he can't dismiss. I'll be at the wedding anyway for the financial documents. If you can arrange for law enforcement to be present, I can stall the signing indefinitely. But Harold will need to see incontrovertible proof. He's not going to accept accusations against Isabella without absolute certainty. Rodriguez was already reaching for his phone. I have contacts in the Houston Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Sarah Walsh specializes in elder fraud cases. She can have officers present at the wedding under the pretense of security for a high-profile financial transaction. Will they arrest Isabella and Marcus? Thomas asked. Not without your father's cooperation, Rodriguez replied. But their presence will prevent any immediate financial transfers and give us time to present our case. Margaret was taking detailed notes, her legal mind organizing our strategy. We present the evidence systematically: false identity documentation, previous victim testimony, financial trail analysis, DNA proof of paternity, and communications with their criminal network. Even if Dad is emotionally compromised, he's still a rational businessman. What if he refuses to listen? I asked. What if he's so invested emotionally that he dismisses everything as lies? Rodriguez looked directly at me, his expression grave. Then we'll have done everything possible to protect him. Sometimes you can't save people from themselves, even when you love them. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dad. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Isabella is so excited to officially become part of the family. This is the happiest I've been since your mother passed away. The message felt like a knife to my chest. In his mind, tomorrow represented a new beginning, a chance at happiness after years of grief. For us, it represented the potential destruction of everything he'd worked to build. 16 hours until the wedding. 16 hours to save our father from the most sophisticated con artists any of us had ever encountered. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was airtight, and the authorities were prepared to intervene. But our biggest obstacle remained the man we were trying to protect. Friday evening, 12 hours before the wedding, we made our last desperate attempt to reach Dad through reason. The 3 of us sat in his study, surrounded by the oil paintings and petroleum industry awards that chronicled 5 decades of building Whitman Oil into a Texas empire. Dad looked happier than I'd seen him since Mom's funeral. His face glowed with anticipation, and he wore the expression of a man who believed he'd found a second chance at love. It made what we had to do infinitely harder. Dad, we need to talk to you about Isabella, Margaret began, her voice carefully measured. We've discovered some information that concerns us. His expression immediately shifted to defensive irritation. If this is another attempt to convince me I'm making a mistake, please, just listen, Thomas interrupted, pulling out Rodriguez's evidence folder. "We hired a private investigator. What we found isn't opinion or suspicion. It's documented fact." Dad's eyes hardened. "You hired an investigator? To spy on the woman I love? On your future stepmother?" The hurt in his voice was genuine and deep. In his mind, we'd betrayed him by questioning Isabella's authenticity. But we pressed forward because we had no choice. "Her name isn't Isabella Martinez," I said. "It's Elena Vasquez. She's been married for 4 years to Marcus, your gardener. They're professional con artists who've defrauded at least 3 other elderly men in Texas and Arizona." "That's ridiculous," Dad snapped. "Isabella would never. She's carrying my child, for God's sake. How can you make such vicious accusations?" Margaret spread out the DNA test results. "The child isn't yours, Dad. Genetic testing proves Marcus is the biological father. They're running a sophisticated romance fraud operation, and you're their biggest target yet." Dad stared at the documents without really seeing them. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained firm. "These could be fabricated. Anyone can print official-looking papers. You're so desperate to prevent my happiness that you'd manufacture evidence." "Dad, look at this," Thomas said, showing him photographs of Elena with previous victims. "This is Isabella, Elena, with Walter Pemberton in Dallas, James Morrison in Phoenix, Robert Chen in Fort Worth. She used the same tactics with all of them. The vulnerable young woman, the pregnancy, the urgent need for financial protection." For a moment, something flickered in Dad's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of doubt. But then his face hardened again, and he pushed the photographs away. "I don't care what games you think you're playing, but they end now. Isabella has shown me more genuine love and devotion in 8 months than I've felt since your mother passed away. She doesn't care about my money. She cares about me. Dad, they've already moved $200 million through international accounts," Margaret said desperately. "The transfer records show systematic liquidation of your assets over the past 3 months. This isn't love, it's theft. Those transfers are protection for Isabella and our child." His voice rose to a shout. "Something I should have done months ago instead of listening to your constant objections to my happiness. Rodriguez had warned us this might happen. When victims are emotionally captured by their abusers, they often defend the abuser more fiercely than they'd defend themselves. Dad wasn't just refusing to see the truth, he was actively fighting against it." "Where is Isabella tonight?" I asked. "Why isn't she here during this conversation?" "She's resting. The pregnancy has been difficult, and tomorrow's stress—" Dad stopped abruptly, realizing he'd revealed something significant. "What stress?" Margaret pressed. "If this is a happy occasion, why would she be stressed?" Dad's face flushed. "The stress of dealing with family members who clearly resent her presence and want to destroy our relationship." But I caught something else in his expression. For just a moment, when he mentioned Isabella's stress, he looked uncertain. Maybe some part of him was beginning to question why his bride-to-be wasn't excited about their wedding day. Thomas pulled out his phone. "Dad, I'm going to call Isabella right now. Ask her to come down and discuss these accusations directly. If she's innocent, she should be eager to clear her name." "You will not harass her the night before our wedding," Dad said firmly. "I've heard enough. If you can't support my happiness, then perhaps you shouldn't attend tomorrow's ceremony." The threat hung in the air like acid smoke from a refinery accident. Dad was prepared to cut us out of his life completely rather than consider that Isabella might be deceiving him. Margaret gathered the evidence documents with professional calm. "Dad, we love you. Everything we've done has been to protect you. When this all comes to light, and it will, please remember that we tried to warn you." "The only thing that will come to light," Dad replied coldly, "is that my children are so selfish and greedy that they'd rather see me die alone than share their inheritance with my new family." As we left the house, I caught a glimpse of Isabella watching from an upstairs window. Even from a distance, her expression looked triumphant. She'd successfully turned our father against us while maintaining her role as the innocent victim of family jealousy. "He's not going to listen," Thomas said as we stood in the circular driveway. "Even with overwhelming evidence, he's choosing to believe her over us." Then we go to Plan B, Margaret replied grimly. Public confrontation at the wedding. Police presence. All evidence presented in front of witnesses. If he won't listen to reason privately, maybe public embarrassment will force him to face reality. Rodriguez was waiting by his car, having observed our meeting from outside. How did he react? Complete denial, I said. He's convinced we're lying to prevent his happiness. That's the psychological capture I warned you about. Tomorrow will be difficult for everyone, especially your father. But it's the only way to break through his emotional barriers. 8 hours until the wedding. 8 hours until we destroyed our father's happiness to save his fortune. I just hoped that when the truth finally came out, he'd understand we'd acted from love, not greed. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright over Houston, the kind of perfect Texas day that made Dad's garden venue ideal for outdoor weddings. White chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a flower-covered archway where my father would marry the woman who intended to steal his fortune. By 10 a.m., guests were arriving at the Whitman estate. Oil executives, country club friends, longtime family associates, all invited to witness what they believed was a romantic late-life love story. None of them knew they were about to see the most expensive con game in Texas history exposed. Rodriguez positioned himself near the catering tent, video equipment concealed in an equipment bag. Detective Sarah Walsh and 2 plainclothes officers mingled among the guests, ready to intervene when we presented our evidence. Margaret carried a briefcase containing DNA results, financial records, and photographic proof of Elena's criminal history. Remember, Rodriguez said through our earpieces, wait until after the vows but before the financial documents are signed. We need your father committed to the ceremony but not yet legally bound to the asset transfers. Dad looked distinguished in his charcoal gray suit, greeting guests with the confident smile of a man who'd found happiness again. At 74, he moved with the energy of someone 20 years younger, revitalized by what he believed was genuine love. Isabella, Elena, looked stunning in an elegant ivory dress that emphasized her pregnancy. She played the radiant bride perfectly, accepting congratulations with shy smiles and grateful tears. Several guests commented on how lucky Dad was to find such a devoted young woman. "She's good," Thomas muttered, watching Elena charm Mrs. Pemberton from the country club. "If we didn't know the truth, even I'd believe her performance." Marcus was conspicuously absent. According to the catering staff, he'd called in sick that morning, a convenient excuse that positioned him safely away from potential arrest when the truth emerged. The ceremony began at noon, with Dad's longtime pastor, Reverend Williams, officiating. Dad stood at the altar looking genuinely happy, probably thinking about the new family he was creating and the legacy he was protecting. Elena walked down the aisle to Pachelbel's canon, every inch the blushing bride. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Williams began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Harold and Isabella in holy matrimony." My stomach churned as the familiar words continued. In minutes, Dad would be legally married to a woman whose entire identity was fabricated. But we had to wait. Interrupting during the vows would look like jealous family interference. We needed the ceremony to proceed far enough that Dad's emotional investment was complete. "Harold, do you take Isabella to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Dad said, his voice strong and certain. "Isabella, do you take Harold to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Elena's response was soft, demure, perfect. "I do. By the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Harold, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful, filled with Dad's genuine emotion. The guests applauded enthusiastically, many wiping away tears at the touching sight of an elderly widower finding love again. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Williams announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Harold Whitman." This was our moment. As the newlyweds turned to face their guests, Rodriguez began recording. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out the DNA results. Detective Walsh moved closer to the front rows. "Before we proceed to the reception," I called out, standing from my seat in the front row, "there's something important everyone needs to know about this marriage." Dad's expression shifted from joy to confusion to anger in seconds. "Jonathan, what are you doing?" "Dad, the woman you just married isn't who she claims to be." I held up the DNA test results. "Her real name is Elena Vasquez. She's married to Marcus Delgado, and the child she's carrying belongs to him, not you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elena's face went pale, but she maintained her composure with impressive skill. "Harold, I don't know what they're talking about. This is terrible. Why are they trying to ruin our special day?" "Mrs. Vasquez," Detective Walsh said, stepping forward and displaying her badge. "I'm Detective Sarah Walsh with the Houston Police Department. We need to ask you some questions about financial fraud allegations." The crowd erupted in confused murmurs. Dad looked stunned, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and the first hints of dawning realization. Margaret approached the altar with her briefcase. "Dad, Elena Vasquez has been operating romance fraud schemes across the Southwest for 6 years. She's married to Marcus Delgado, your gardener. They've stolen over $1 million from previous victims using the exact same tactics they used on you." "This is insane," Elena said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Harold, don't listen to them. They're trying to destroy us because they want your money for themselves." Rodriguez stepped forward with his video camera. "Mrs. Vasquez, can you explain these photographs showing you with Walter Pemberton in Dallas, James Morrison in Phoenix, and Robert Chen in Fort Worth? Can you explain why you used different names with each of these elderly gentlemen?" Dad stared at the photographs, his face gray with shock. For the first time since this nightmare began, he was seeing evidence he couldn't dismiss as family jealousy or fabricated documentation. "The DNA test results prove definitively that Marcus Delgado is the biological father of your child," Margaret said gently. "Dad, you've been the victim of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy." Elena made one last desperate attempt. "Harold, they're lying. These people hate me because I took your mother's place. They'll say anything to—" "Stop," Dad whispered, his voice barely audible. Then, louder. "Just stop." He looked at Elena with eyes that finally saw clearly. The woman he'd married, the future mother of his child, the love he'd thought would heal his loneliness. None of it had been real. "Officers," he said to Detective Walsh, his voice hollow but steady, "please arrest my wife for fraud." The wedding reception tent became an impromptu crime scene as Detective Walsh read Elena her rights. The guests stood in shocked silence, still processing the revelation that they'd just witnessed a criminal being married to one of Houston's most prominent businessmen. "Elena Vasquez, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse," Detective Walsh announced, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd. "You have the right to remain silent." Elena's composure finally cracked. The demure bride facade dissolved, replaced by cold calculation as she scanned the crowd for escape routes. "This is harassment," she said, her voice losing its soft vulnerability. "Harold, tell them they're making a mistake." But Dad wasn't looking at her anymore. He stood frozen at the altar, staring at the DNA test results Margaret had handed him. The paper trembled in his hands as the full scope of his deception became clear. "The child," he whispered. "All this time, I thought I was going to be a father again." "You were being manipulated by professionals," Rodriguez said, approaching with additional evidence folders. "Mr. Whitman, Elena, and Marcus have been running these operations across 5 states. You're victim number 7 that we can document." Thomas pulled out his phone, showing Dad the financial tracking data. "They've already moved over $200 million through international accounts. The trust structures they convinced you to establish were designed to make asset recovery nearly impossible." $200 million? Dad's face went ashen. "That represents the company's operating capital, our employee pension contributions, the charitable foundation funds." "We can recover most of it," Margaret said quickly. The transfers haven't been completed yet, and with criminal charges filed, we can freeze the international accounts. Detective Walsh was coordinating with her backup officers while Elena stood in handcuffs, still maintaining her innocence. "Where is Marcus Delgado?" she asked Rodriguez. "Phoenix PD picked him up an hour ago trying to board a flight to Mexico. He had cash, fake documents, and a detailed escape plan. They've been preparing for this contingency since they started the operation." Elena's eyes flashed with genuine fear for the first time. Marcus had been caught, their escape route compromised, and their carefully constructed identities exposed. "The game was over. How long have you known?" she asked Dad directly, abandoning her helpless victim act entirely. "I didn't know," Dad replied, his voice hollow with betrayal. "Even now, part of me doesn't want to believe it. You made me feel alive again after 3 years of loneliness. Was any of it real?" Elena studied him for a moment, perhaps calculating whether one final manipulation might work. Then she shrugged with chilling indifference. "You were a job, Harold. A very profitable job. Nothing more." The words hit Dad like physical blows. "I watched my father, who'd negotiated billion-dollar oil deals, who'd built an empire through sheer determination, crumble under the weight of emotional betrayal." Rodriguez opened another evidence folder, revealing the full scope of their criminal network. "Elena, we know about the architect. We have communications showing this operation was part of a larger organization targeting wealthy elderly men across the Southwest. The pregnancy timeline was calculated to coincide with your estate planning discussions," Detective Walsh added. "They knew from Marcus's reconnaissance when you'd be most vulnerable to manipulation." Elena remained silent, but her expression confirmed everything. Every moment of apparent affection, every conversation about the future, every intimate detail she'd shared, all of it had been performance designed to extract maximum financial benefit. "The other victims?" Dad asked quietly. "What happened to them?" Rodriguez pulled out victim impact statements. Walter Pemberton lost his ranch and had to move in with his daughter. James Morrison declared bankruptcy. Robert Chen developed severe depression and required psychiatric care. You're lucky your children intervened when they did." Dad turned to look at us, his eyes filled with shame and gratitude. "You tried to warn me. You presented evidence, and I refused to listen. I accused you of jealousy and greed when you were trying to protect me." "Dad, you were grieving," I said. "Grief makes people vulnerable. Elena and Marcus are professionals who specifically target that vulnerability. Margaret was already coordinating with the financial recovery team. Robert Chen is preparing emergency injunctions to freeze all international transfers. We should be able to recover most of the assets within 48 hours. Elena was led away in handcuffs, her wedding dress incongruous with the reality of her arrest. As the police car pulled away from the estate, I noticed several guests quietly slipping out, probably uncomfortable with the drama they'd witnessed. But many stayed, surrounding Dad with support and concern. These were people who'd known him for decades, who understood that even successful, intelligent individuals could fall victim to sophisticated predators. "Harold," said Mrs. Pemberton from the country club, "you're not the first person to be deceived by criminals, and you won't be the last. What matters is that your family loved you enough to fight for you." Reverend Williams approached Dad with pastoral concern. "Harold, would you like me to arrange for the marriage to be annulled? Given the fraudulent circumstances, the church can declare it null and void." "Yes," Dad said immediately. "I want no legal connection to that woman." As the afternoon progressed, the truth continued emerging. Rodriguez's investigation had uncovered Elena and Marcus's base of operations in Phoenix, a sophisticated setup with multiple false identities, detailed victim profiles, and communication equipment for coordinating with their criminal network. The architect turns out to be Elena's brother, Carlos Vasquez, Rodriguez explained. He's the mastermind who identifies targets, plans operations, and manages the financial aspects. Phoenix PD arrested him this morning with detailed files on over 30 potential victims across 7 states. The scope was staggering. What we'd thought was an isolated incident was actually part of a criminal enterprise that had stolen millions from vulnerable elderly people across the Southwest. "Dad," Thomas said as evening approached, "we need to discuss security measures. There might be other members of this organization who see you as unfinished business." Dad nodded, his businessman's instincts finally overriding his emotional vulnerability. "Contact our security firm. I want the house protected and background checks on all staff members." As guests finally departed and cleanup crews began dismantling the wedding decorations, Dad sat alone in his study staring at his wedding ring. After a moment, he pulled it off and dropped it in the wastebasket. "I feel like a fool," he said when I joined him. "You feel like someone who trusted the wrong person," I replied. "That's not the same thing." The hardest part was knowing that Elena had exploited Dad's deepest vulnerability, his loneliness after losing Mom. But maybe, in exposing her deception, we'd also open the door for genuine healing to begin. 3 months after the wedding that never should have happened, Elena Vasquez and Marcus Delgado sat in federal court facing a judge who'd spent 20 years dealing with financial crimes. The formal charges read like a textbook case of elder fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and racketeering. The defendants operated a sophisticated criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable elderly victims across multiple states, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Morrison announced to the packed courtroom. Their crimes resulted in over $3 million in documented losses and immeasurable emotional trauma to their victims. Dad sat in the front row, looking older but steadier than he had since Mom passed away. The past 3 months had been difficult, dealing with media attention, recovering assets, and processing the emotional betrayal. But facing his abusers in court seemed to provide closure he desperately needed. Elena wore a plain orange jumpsuit instead of designer clothes, her pregnancy now obviously showing. She'd maintained her innocence throughout pre-trial proceedings, claiming she genuinely loved Dad and that the evidence against her was fabricated by jealous family members. Marcus had taken a different approach, cooperating with authorities to reduce his sentence. His testimony revealed the intricate planning behind their operation. "We spent 6 months researching Harold Whitman," Marcus admitted from the witness stand. Elena studied his business interviews, learned about his wife's death, identified his emotional vulnerabilities. "We knew exactly how to approach him." The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Financial records showing systematic asset transfers, communications with other criminal network members, DNA proof that Marcus was the biological father, and testimony from previous victims. Walter Pemberton flew in from Dallas to testify about losing his ranch. Elena convinced me she needed money for her sick mother's medical treatments. I trusted her because she seemed genuinely caring. I lost everything and had to move in with my daughter. James Morrison's testimony via video link was even more heartbreaking. She told me I reminded her of her deceased father. "I was so lonely after my wife died that I believed her completely. The financial loss was devastating, but the emotional betrayal was worse." Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic psychologist, explained how romance fraud specifically targets elderly victims. Criminals like Elena and Marcus study grief patterns, identifying when victims are most vulnerable to emotional manipulation. They create elaborate personas designed to fulfill the victim's specific psychological needs. The defense tried arguing that Elena genuinely cared for Dad, and that the pregnancy proved their relationship was real. But the DNA evidence and Marcus's detailed testimony about their 4-year marriage destroyed that narrative completely. The defendant's pregnancy was strategically timed to maximize emotional impact, Prosecutor Morrison argued. She used an unborn child as a weapon to manipulate an elderly man into transferring his life savings. Elena's sentencing hearing was particularly difficult. Several victims gave impact statements describing how her deception had destroyed their financial security and psychological well-being. "I built Whitman Oil over 50 years, Dad testified, his voice steady but emotional. Elena Vasquez nearly destroyed that legacy in 8 months, but worse than the financial theft was the betrayal of trust. She exploited my grief over my wife's death and my desire to build a new family. The judge, Honor Linda Martinez, had clearly been affected by the testimony. Ms. Vasquez, your crimes represent a particularly cruel form of theft. You didn't just steal money, you stole hope, trust, and emotional security from vulnerable people during their most difficult periods. Elena received 12 years in federal prison for her role in the conspiracy. Marcus got 8 years for cooperation. Carlos Vasquez, the architect, received 15 years as the criminal enterprise's mastermind. But prison sentences were only part of the justice process. The financial recovery had been surprisingly successful thanks to Margaret's legal expertise and rapid intervention by federal authorities. We recovered approximately 85% of the transferred assets. Our attorney Robert Chen explained after the sentencing. The remaining 15% was lost to transaction fees and accounts we couldn't trace, but Harold's financial position is essentially intact. More importantly, the investigation had exposed a criminal network that had been operating across 7 states. FBI raids in Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Albuquerque resulted in additional arrests and the recovery of stolen assets for dozens of other victims. Detective Walsh visited Dad personally to provide closure on the investigation. Mr. Whitman, your willingness to cooperate despite the personal embarrassment helped us shut down one of the most sophisticated elder fraud operations we've encountered. Your case will be studied in law enforcement training programs for years. The media attention had been intense, but ultimately positive. Dad's story became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of elderly individuals to romantic scams, leading to increased awareness and protective legislation. The Harold Whitman case demonstrates how even successful, intelligent individuals can become victims of sophisticated predators, wrote the Houston Chronicle's financial crimes reporter. His family's intervention and willingness to pursue justice has protected countless other potential victims. 3 months after Elena's sentencing, Dad seemed like himself again. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by the sharp focus that had built an oil empire. He'd increased security at the house, implemented new financial oversight procedures, and started speaking at senior centers about romance fraud prevention. I want other people to learn from my mistakes, he told a gathering at the River Oaks Community Center. Grief makes us vulnerable, but that's no excuse for not protecting ourselves and our families. The baby had been born while Elena was in custody. Family services arranged for adoption through Marcus's sister in Phoenix, ensuring the child would grow up far from the criminal influences of its biological parents. That innocent child shouldn't suffer for its parents' crimes, Dad said when asked about the baby. I hope it has a good life with people who will love it genuinely. Elena would be eligible for parole in 8 years. Marcus in 6. By then, Dad would be in his 80s, hopefully surrounded by family who genuinely cared about him rather than his bank account. Justice had been served, but the real victory was simpler. Our family was whole again. 1 year after the wedding that exposed the most sophisticated con game in Texas history, Dad stood in his garden where Elena Vasquez had nearly stolen his fortune and his dignity. The white chairs and flower archway were gone, replaced by a memorial bench dedicated to Mom's memory. I come out here every morning now, he told me as we walked the flagstone paths together. It helps me remember what real love looked like. At 75, Dad seemed stronger than he had since Mom's death. The ordeal with Elena had been devastating, but surviving it had given him perspective on grief, family, and the difference between genuine affection and calculated manipulation. I've been thinking about legacy, he continued, settling onto the memorial bench. Not just the business legacy, but the lessons this experience taught our family. The past year had brought remarkable healing. Dad had implemented comprehensive financial safeguards to prevent future exploitation, multiple oversight requirements for large transfers, mandatory family notification for significant changes, and regular security reviews of all household staff. But, more importantly, he'd reconnected with his children in ways that hadn't existed since before Mom's illness. You know what I realized? He said. watching the sunrise paint the Houston skyline gold and orange. When Elena was isolating me from you, I let it happen because I was afraid you only visited out of obligation. I was so focused on not being a burden that I pushed away the people who genuinely cared about me. Thomas had started visiting twice weekly, bringing his own children to spend time with their grandfather. Margaret called every evening after work, sharing details about her cases and asking Dad's advice on business matters. I'd moved my office to Houston, managing our Gulf Coast operations from a building 20 minutes from the family home. We should have been more present after Mom died, I admitted. We assumed you wanted space to grieve privately. We both made assumptions, Dad replied. The difference is, my assumptions nearly cost me everything. The financial recovery had been even more successful than initially projected. Federal investigators had traced Elena and Marcus's network through multiple offshore accounts, recovering stolen assets for victims across 7 states. Our family had lost less than $50,000 pocket change compared to the hundreds of millions that could have disappeared. But Dad's real satisfaction came from the broader impact of his case. Got a letter last week from an elderly woman in Phoenix, he said, pulling out a handwritten note. She said seeing our story on the news helped her recognize that her young boyfriend was probably running a similar scam. She called police instead of giving him access to her retirement accounts. The Harold Whitman Foundation, established with some of the recovered funds, now provided education and support services for elderly fraud victims. Dad spoke regularly at senior centers, community groups, and law enforcement training sessions about recognizing romance scams. People think intelligence protects you from these criminals, he told audiences. But emotional vulnerability trumps intelligence every time. The key is having family and friends who love you enough to ask hard questions. Elena Vasquez had been transferred to a federal facility in Pennsylvania, where she was serving her 12-year sentence. She'd given birth to a healthy daughter who was being raised by Marcus's sister in Phoenix, far from the criminal influences of her biological parents. Marcus had been released after 4 years for cooperation, but remained under federal supervision and was prohibited from contact with elderly individuals outside his immediate family. Carlos Vasquez, the architect, would remain in federal prison until he was nearly 60. Do you ever wonder what Elena's doing now? I asked. Dad considered the question carefully. I hope she's getting psychological help. What she did was evil, but I've learned that holding on to anger only hurts the person carrying it. She took 8 months of my life. I won't give her any more time than that. The house felt different now, more secure but also more welcoming. Dad had hired Rosa Martinez, a 60-year-old housekeeper whose references went back 30 years and whose own adult children worked in law enforcement. He'd also installed comprehensive security systems and required background checks for any service personnel. Trust, but verify, he said with a wry smile. Reagan's foreign policy advice works pretty well for domestic situations, too. The oil business was thriving under new leadership structures that included more family involvement. Thomas had joined the board of directors, Margaret served as the company's general counsel, and I'd taken over Gulf Coast operations. Dad remained chairman but had stepped back from day-to-day management. Whitman Oil will survive long after I'm gone, he said with satisfaction. But more importantly, the family will survive. Elena's greatest failure was underestimating how much you children actually loved me. On quiet evenings, Dad would sit in his study reading letters from other fraud victims who'd found the courage to report their experiences after hearing his story. Law enforcement agencies credited the Whitman case with exposing a criminal network that had operated successfully for nearly a decade. Sometimes I think your mother sent Elena into my life, Dad said as we headed back toward the house. Not to steal from me, but to teach me that I couldn't honor her memory by withdrawing from the people who loved me. It was a generous interpretation of events that had nearly destroyed him financially and emotionally. But Dad had always been someone who found meaning in adversity, who extracted lessons from setbacks. What would you tell other families facing similar situations? I asked. That love means asking hard questions, even when it's uncomfortable. That protecting someone sometimes requires making them angry at you, and that criminals like Elena succeed because they isolate their victims from the people who genuinely care about them. As we reached the house, Dad paused to look back at the garden where he'd nearly married a woman whose entire identity was fabricated. "I'm grateful," he said simply. "Grateful for family who fought for me, grateful for justice, grateful for the chance to help other people avoid the same mistakes. Elena took a lot from me, but she also gave me something valuable, the knowledge that my children love me enough to risk my anger to protect me." The sun was fully up now, painting the Whitman estate in warm Texas light. Dad had survived the most sophisticated con game of his life and emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected to family than he'd been in years. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the worst disasters.